Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Prince of Egypt from 1998. This is a movie that for a very long time I have had no interest in watching, for a variety of reasons. However, for context, the reason I ended up coming around to this this week was that it came up in conversation in the last month or so. Just a side note somebody was making about how much they enjoyed it, and then just the other day I saw I hesitate to call it a meme, but sure, a tweet, one of those viral tweets going around where somebody tweeted out how they learned that during the production of The Prince of Egypt, when there were problem animators on this movie, that they would be quote unquote Shrek'd by DreamWorks and sent to work on Shrek. Which, sidebar, right at the beginning, I looked into that a little bit. It seems to be mostly not true, possibly in some limited cases, but there's only extremely limited anecdotal evidence that was done, and it's only by it's an anecdote, a second party anecdote in a memoir that everybody seems to cite as the source of this ultimate truth. Whereas there's a bunch of other people who have come out after and said, I worked there and that was not true, though it did have a lot of production issues over the several years that it was being produced. Anyway, so back to Prince of Egypt. I think we need to address the elephant in the room right up front, which is partially also the reason I haven't wanted to watch this in the first place. This is ultimately a religious story. This is a rendition of the Book of Exodus, the Abrahamic mythos, I have no idea what story it is in whatever different rendition, but it's got these connotations and particularly attachments to Abrahamic mythos, Abrahamic religion, and yeah, that's something I wasn't around. I avoided when I was a kid and never really had had plenty of reason not to go get interested in it later. Anyway, I am going to try and keep this an impartial review, and I think, actually, not to spoil, but I think this movie's quite good. So I think I'm pretty impartial on this. But it does ultimately influence my interpretation, and I think everybody's interpretation of this movie, if you are from, in particular, the United States, or any other country around the world. Honestly, the spread of religion influences culture in a great many ways that's a whole subject for a lifetime of study. Anyway, we'll set that mostly aside, except for in a few places where I think it's appropriate to talk about it. I never watched this. I've known a few people over the years who have said that it is fondly remembered or even one of their favorite films, but I never got around to watching it, and so I thought I'd finally do that, and was pleasantly surprised, to say the least, right up front. This is a surprisingly nuanced and careful take on the story, given all of the context around it, while still also having a surprising amount of let's say story adaptation changes that I think work mostly favorably for it. It's an interesting interpretation for sure. So this is an animated film. It's also basically a musical film, by all accounts. This is not surprising. This is right at the beginning of DreamWorks. This is basically this would have been DreamWorks' first ever movie release, if not for Ants, which, God, what a curse on that's a terrible movie. Looks like a knockoff of Bug's Life. It's awful. Ants is bad. This came out I think only a few months after it. It was being worked on in parallel at DreamWorks, which was just brand new, basically. And there's a whole history with Amblin Entertainment and Steven Spielberg and a whole Bob Iger and Jeffrey Katzenberg. And I've even talked previously about some of the in one of the movies that I've talked about before, talking about the context of the evolution of Disney's animation studios and the split-offs that happened after it. I think I've talked about it a couple of times. Anyway, the DreamWorks story is a story for another time, or one that I've already partially had. But it is contextually interesting here in particular because right off the bat, the animation through and through this is excellent. Like, it's really very, very good. I don't know all the details of how this was animated and how much of it was done digitally versus traditionally, but it does not give away stylistically that it is CGI. There are some elements of it that are, how do I say this? They're shockingly good for 2D animation. They include three-dimensional shading and movement details that are not traditionally found in a lot of 2D animation. But this is also in a weird space in the sort of history of animation where 2D animation had been getting 2D and traditional animation had been getting better and better, and had also been sort of starting to blur the lines with 3D animation and digital animation tools and all these other things. But this remains a fantastic looking movie, top to bottom. It's got some very traditional looking animation styles in some respects, and even has things that are very reminiscent of matte paintings for backgrounds, including that sort of soft painterly style and line work, while also having character animation that is very fluid, very sharp, and like the style, all of the stylings of the characters are super important and super interesting for a whole variety of reasons. I can't think of any other movie that looks like this in terms of its particular style, especially in this sort of not entirely realistic, but sort of blurring the area between true sort of, it's not aiming for photorealism, but it is stylistic in a way that still seems like it's going for less cartoony. It gives a very human weight to all the characters. They don't move, Disney, especially through the 90s and 2000s, was largely animating characters that were very cartoonish, very sort of exaggerated in various proportions, very, you could basically believe that most of them, even in their more serious films, often could be subject to slapstick and come away from it completely unscathed. That was just stylistically sort of how the animation felt. This is a much more sort of weighty animation, while also being sort of ethereally smooth. I don't know how else to really describe it if you haven't seen it. It's very clean. This is the kind of thing that makes me think it's a little bit more relying on digital tools. They're not using a lot of traditional hand animation shortcuts that are very necessary in order to reduce the sort of load on animators. You can't hand animate like every tiny transition in movement. It's just, you have to take shortcuts, and that's why 2D animation looks the way it does. So the combination of the sort of more realistic style, but still a stylized sort of aesthetic, while still having this smoothness and this weight to the characters, is a really interesting mix that I can't even think of many things that really fall into that category in the first place, let alone some of the choices that are made for that aesthetic to have these sort of exaggerated features that still don't look cartoony. I think I listen. All right, I just have to say it. Moses is a little bit bug-eyed, and he reminds me a little bit too much of Sid the Sloth. I'm sorry. I can't be the first person who's had this observation. I know I haven't. But it's just sort of there. He's got this very sort of slimmed down jaw and this very wide upper part of his head, and his eyes are very far spaced apart, and he doesn't look awkward at all. It's just a little bit odd if you stare at it a little too hard too long. And that is true of like most of the characters, but it's particularly true of Moses. So like overall, in the stylings and the animation and all of that, and lots of the effects, which there are quite a few effects that look fantastic, whether it's like this sort of ethereal mist or these plumes of fire or water or whatever. It all looks really, really good. So that all holds up fantastically on that alone. If you're an appreciator of animation, I think this stands up pretty well. Also, in terms of both that and sort of the nature of the adaptation, it's very interesting to note some of the changes from the big air quotes original text that are made in terms of who the characters are, how old they are, and what they look like. In most interpretations and in the original text, I'm not by any means a particularly knowledgeable on the subject, but I have a rudimentary understanding of the stories and the mythos, etc., etc. So to see these characters portrayed largely as people probably no older than 40 when the original text would tell you that they are much, much older. And the changes that are made therein are interesting in terms of just looking towards a certain visual appeal. Put a pin in that for a second. The other part is this entire movie is full of people with dark skin, which is not very common, even in other portrayals of biblical stories or Abrahamic mythos. It's not usually acknowledged, and that's a particularly American problem too. I mean, it's more widespread. It came from Europe. It's a whole thing. We could get into a whole discussion about why everybody in portrayals of Abrahamic myth who are living in the desert in the areas around the Levant are so light-skinned. I mean, some of them are, but not like that. Not anyway. This is interesting to me, not just because it's a change from traditional portrayals, but because it is a very, very much a gamble in terms of the appeal of your potential appeal of your movie to an American movie-going audience, especially when a substantial proportion of that audience is probably going to be at least a little bit familiar with and even picky about the way things are portrayed. So the fact that this is so seemingly pretty universally appreciated and lauded and did particularly well in theaters and in the time since is fascinating to me. Not necessarily what I would expect it, or at least something I would have expected to see more notes about, like, oh, it got backlash from this group and that group or whatever. Surprisingly, not the case. Glad that worked out for them, because I think that gives a little bit more historicity to the whole thing. Takes it a little bit out of the nature of the mythology and a little bit more towards like telling a real story. In that same way, listen, I'm not going to nitpick the story structure of the Book of Exodus. That's that'll get me in trouble. So I'm not going to talk too much about the plot itself, but I think there are some things that are interesting about how it's interpreted and portrayed here. This is a movie that is much less focused on the actual beats therein and much more interested in focusing on the sort of relationships and the humanity of various characters. In rewriting some of the, the interpreted text, there are several changes to the relationships between, in particular, Moses and Ramses, that make this a much more compelling story in terms of understanding their relationship and their individual struggles and their basically their personal interests. The traditional portrayal would be a much more one-sided interpretation. And this is not to say that this movie is reversing that by any means, but it at least portrays all characters as having like a modicum of humanity and not purely. It's not purely a good versus evil story. In a way, if we can flip this back around to something I said to put a pin in, which I often forget to actually come back to those pins that I make, this interestingly kind of parallels a more traditional hero's journey story structure that we've seen in lots of other animated movies, especially aimed at kids, over however much time, but even in some that I've watched in this series, where you have gotta dance around this a little bit, like a call to action or a refusal of the call. There is a mentor figure. There is like the hero being imbued with powers or abilities or whatever else. And in a lot of ways, those are really important changes, or not even changes. They're just changes in focus, really. It's not really adding anything to the story so much as interpreting it cinematically. And that's important because the focus of the story originally is not really about the character or the acts. It's about sort of the overarching narrative that extends well past this particular set of events. So turning it into a hero's journey, and especially against a villain who is somewhat more human in their nature, makes this a more interesting thing to watch. That said, this has a few problems in terms of, if you really want to start getting into questions about, I'm not getting into that. I was going to start talking about the agency of the main character, et cetera, but that's not really relevant. It negatively affects how compelling the story is overall. And if this were a completely isolated story, I would nitpick it for that. And I think you still technically should. But for reasons, it's obvious why that wasn't done. So there's a lot of good production and a lot of good interpretation and a lot of good modernization, in a sense, that has gone into this film in a way that is progressive to a level that I didn't expect out of a movie from 1998. I think there are some other things that it does quite well, some sort of not quite as well, but are okay. This movie does get a lot of praise for its voice acting. I think the voice acting is fine. I don't think it's fantastic. I think it's just okay. And it does have a very star-studded cast. Unfortunately, we just talked about this recently. This is from the era where voice actors are not taken all that seriously, and largely for both sales reasons and for it's mostly for marketing is basically what it comes down to. So this has voices of Val Kilmer and Ralph Fiennes, who I think I talked about Ralph Fiennes recently. I don't remember if it was on this show or not. Ralph Fiennes is an underrated actor and one people forget about a lot. But he's on the cast. He's a fantastic actor. What do we have? Michelle Pfeiffer, Sandra Bullock, Jeff Goldblum, Danny Glover, Patrick Stewart, Helen Mirren, Steve Martin, Martin Short. I mean, like that's a very star-studded cast. And to be totally honest, couldn't pick out a single one of them. And some of their voices I know quite well. Um, whether that's a question of their voice direction or the mastering or whatever else, or whether they were deliberately asked to, take certain precautions so they weren't as identifiable. I don't know. But if their intention was to show off who the people were, which hopefully wasn't the case, then they did a good job, bad job. They did a good job for me because I don't want them to be noticeable. Bad job for them because they were probably trying to use that for marketing. Anyway, what is very good is the music. The music in this is, I think, quite fantastic and rather underrated. But back to the elephant in the room, it's hard to it's hard to really appreciate the music when the music, basically all of the music, fundamentally sounds like something somebody might sing in church. It's just the nature of the text. Could they have written songs that were all completely absent from that? Maybe, but it's not even that it's specifically intended to be religious reference. It's that the nature of the structure of the story with deific beings being key to the plot, the whole plot hinges on it. The whole plot hinges on things like belief and these other things that are nebulous in nature and really only show up literarily when you're talking about religion or things very near it. So unfortunately, a fantastic soundtrack that I'll probably never hear again. Not because the music isn't good, but like there's a stigma about it. And I'm not even going to say unrightly so. I don't want to, sidebar for me, really personally, really off to the side here. I don't want to listen to that. I don't want to listen to anything that reminds me anything about religion. That's just me. Doesn't matter how good it is. Sorry. I've done my time in the mines. I've sung my songs that I've done choir. I've done all that. I've been there. I don't need to deliberately end up in that place. So back to the movie. The soundtrack's really good. There's no two ways about that. The nature of the story means that it is a little bit put in a box as a result. It just has to live in the space that it is. And that's sort of fine. On the same sort of subject, this is good and bad at the same time. As with many of these many animated films that I've talked about previously, I'm not entirely sure who this movie is for. Because the Book of Exodus is not for kids. I know, trying to keep my personal commentary out of this a lot, but the Book of Exodus is scary. This story is scary. It is a story about death and disasters and threats of violence and direct violence. And they do an admirable job of interpreting all those things in a way that is visible while making it as minimally traumatizing as possible. Acts of violence are largely shown indirectly. There are lots of direct acts of violence, but they're shown in a way that makes them palatable for kids, I guess. That doesn't make me feel better about showing them to kids, because these are already really touchy subjects. The nature of having a discussion with a person of any age, but especially a child, about slavery and the history of slavery in history, like over many nations, and the nature of human behavior and the nature of conquest and all these other things, is incredibly hard to unpack at a very base level. So I don't love showing violence to kids without an explanation, especially when the explanation is so complicated. That said, it omits direct violence. It doesn't show blood, except for, weirdly, in the one location where it's, required, which is the river of blood. And they don't dance around that. They say exactly what it is. But at the same time, there are some scenes in here that could have been portrayed. Well, I don't know. I have to dance around this both for sociopolitical reasons and for YouTube, because YouTube loves to knock things down for it reads the transcriptions and decides to reduce your reach because of things you've said. I'm not getting any views anyway, whatever. This is a very frank review tonight. So there is the killing of the firstborns. I mean, no two ways about it. And that scene is also done extremely tastefully. It's actually very beautiful. The animation that they did for it, the way that they interpreted the sort of acts as done, the acts of it's like very, very well animated and interpreted in such a smart way. Just side compliment there. Great to the animation direction team there. But like fundamentally, the plague scene and that scene are still scary and traumatizing, I would say, to a kid of a certain age. Who doesn't have a lot to go off of. Like, there's no, especially the plagues thing might be more directly traumatizing, because it's like literally showing all these flashing pictures and scenes of people eating like with bugs and all this other stuff. And I think that would mess me up as a kid. So I don't think it's very well done, but this is all to say that I'm not entirely sure this is appropriate for kids, certainly below maybe teens. It's a little bit disturbing, as the original story is. So it's interesting that they made all those efforts to make it more approachable, and like keep it within the realm of a lower rating, but that I still don't think it's appropriate. That said, in a way, I think it's more impactful. I've said this many times before, that sort of limitations and restrictions are the mother of invention. And so the limitations that were probably given from on high to say we can't have this, and this portrayed because, it'll change the rating of the film. Those forcing these sort of very good, smart, artistic interpretations of various things. Sort of the fact that it may have forced them to make a more visually appealing and beautiful film as a result, I think is a net benefit, incidentally. I don't think I want to see the gritty PG-13 version of this film. I think that would suck. Even if even if it was just to add direct visuals of violence. That would not add impact. I think they do an excellent job of having the same impact, but without having to directly see it. I think it's done very well. Still not for kids, though. What else do I have to say about this film? Is it one that I necessarily want to recommend to people? I mean, it's very well made. I don't think I would necessarily recommend it to anybody for the exact same reason of elephant in the room. But in, certain contexts where I was, recommending it with caveats and a full understanding of things, I think it's very, very well done and worth recognizing, and probably goes, unfortunately, under-recognized because of that elephant in the room. Yeah, I don't think I have a lot else to say. It's just generally pretty well done, if a little bit boring at parts. But that's a story problem. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.